believe we're going to have readings first, just a short little bit. So Martha, did you want to read first?
Certainly. First of all, it's just such a great pleasure to be here, to see friends, and just to be with you two and Mira. So thank you. Thanks to the Center for Fiction. Thanks to Maureen. Thanks. Okay. We were instructed to go short, which I shall. So very quick setup. This is from early on in this book, and I don't think there's anything you need to know. No, I don't think there's anything you need to know. For the time being, I'm living in an in-between place, Lunigiana, a region in upper central Italy, unknown to most foreigners. For the time being, a peculiar way of putting it. Why don't I just say Antonio and I are here for now rather than for the time being. The phrase seems to hint at a future when time might cease being, might devour its own entrails and leave not a shred of itself to measure or consume. Is anything more voracious than time? Sabbatical is the official term for this 14-month stretch of time away from home and work, or leave of absence, as it's sometimes called. Caesura is my own word for it. In music and poetry, a caesura is a pause or break in a melodic line, a moment of in or out breath at a point of rhythmic division. In life, mine anyway, it's a deliberate interruption, a chance to reckon with divisions imposed by loss. Multiple losses, in fact. A friend, Lucy, to heroin 10 years ago, Andrea to cancer 3 years later, and then all in a row, or so it felt, 6 more friends to various illnesses, 1 to suicide in 2006, 7, 8, and 10. Richard, Valeria, Liam, Nuala, Jason, David. In the midst of this stretch, my mother and father, both in their early 80s, had to be relocated to an assisted living community. My father had begun showing early signs of dementia. My mother, who went gradually blind during my childhood and has been sightless for the better part of 4 decades, had a heart attack. A bit later, she fell and broke her pelvis. Though she gradually returned to her usual state, lucid, wry, even-keeled, she can't walk more than a few feet, even with assistance. When I picture her now, I see her feet resting on her wheelchair's metal flippers and her hands in her lap, fidgeting ever so slightly. In all this, I'm a fairly ordinary person. I haven't lost multiple family and friends to war, haven't had to reckon with the grim fact that the numeral 0 at the end turns them into an abstraction, as the poet Zbigniew Herbert put it. Thus far, the deaths that have touched me have been all civilian and mostly a function of illness. My father will be lost to me gradually, I expect, as his dementia increases. As for my mother, well, I've lost multiple versions of her over the years. The mother who would have seen my body become a woman's. The mother who would have gone traveling with me. The mother who would have turned her talents for weaving and ceramics into a genuine art practice. The mother who might have liked or disliked my choices of everything from skirts to men. At the visual level, I mean, which counts for plenty between mothers and daughters. My mother and I never got to bicker over the color of my hair during the years I dyed it. Is that a relief or a deprivation? So I'll stop there. I just thought I'd inundate you with loss since this is about it. Thank you for that.
Charles, do you want to?
No. I would also, before I start, just like to say thank you to the Center for Fiction for having me here, that I'm really honored to sit next to Martha, and also to have read Exes and to be up here with Mira. This is a very special place, and thank you. And thank you all for coming out for this. The 4-year-old ambles out of her pre-kindergarten classroom and into the hallway where she sees all those different women, every one of them expectant, joyous, opening her arms. Every day she does this, ambles out of her class into that hallway. Every day she watches mommies hug all the other children. Caribbean nannies are gathering kids too, but his little girl sees those mommies with their packages of fresh fruit, their baggies of newly steamed broccoli, their applesauce pouches and yogurt containers and goldfish crackers. Her daddy is late again, out of breath, trying to figure out which of his coat pockets has that paltry-ass cheese stick. He's up in the small hours, practicing on her Barbie, refining his technique for French twist braids. His thumbnails are slathered with pink sparkle polish, the result of an hour before bedtime when he needed to keep her occupied. His hands fumble, his manual dexterity light years away from that of women who've been braiding hair since they were 6. The next morning he is woozy but concentrating, making sure to follow each comb stroke so his daughter's hair falls according to the swirling path atop the swirling part along the top, pulling and struggling to separate clumped ends, tangled strands, fumbling with hairpins. Oliver gets surly, ordering, "Sit still already." On cue, the girl pulls away, cries. Yet another school photo where stray, thin hairs form around her head, a backlit halo. And that name, yet again, always that name. The child falls and cries and says it. She doesn't get the desired amount of sprinkles on her donut and blubbers, "I want mama." She doesn't want to clean up her toys, mama. Wants to stay at the playground longer, "I want mama." Wants to play yet another imaginative game with her classmates where they are brothers and sisters, and who is she? Mommy, mommy. And he survived until that sweet, soft, ice cream pleasant and best time of the night, when they are in bed together and she is comfy under the comforter and flirty and loving towards him, gazing at him with what seems unabated love, paying attention to stories and pulling on his ear with affection. He's read 2 full stories and she's rubbing at her eyes with her little hands, and it is time for lights out, that part of the evening where he knows it will start. "I want mama," she says. The hope has been that each time Alice tells her daughter, "Mommy is in your heart," you are in Mommy's heart, Doe will absorb those words, that they will be lodged in her somewhere. Oliver tells his daughter to take a deep breath. He tells her to feel the warm syrup of Mommy's love spreading through her. He tells Doe to take yet another breath and start with the top of her head, now down into her forehead, the syrup of Mommy's love spreading behind her eyes. The girl tries. Her lids open now. The whites of her eyes are large and liquid. Wide hazel irises focus on him. "Why can't I go to Mommy?" "I know Mommy is in the sky," she says. Her voice is light, underdeveloped, committed. "We can take a plane." He allows himself the time to blink, composing himself. "The sky is so very big," he answers. She is undeterred, promising. "I would search every cloud." Thanks.
My landlord didn't want to call the cops. For 5 years, he'd been shuffling me from empty place to empty place while he fixed up the 30 or so eyesores my grandfather sold him. He felt bad about my brother, but bad only gets you so far. Smith Hill was the end of the line. 2 babies had fallen out of windows that year alone, and now a guy was walking around with a sword. If you touched the stove and the refrigerator at the same time, you got a shock to the heart. It felt like a punch. I'd wet my hands and I'd grab hold and I'd come to in another room. I told him I needed one more month for Eli, and he just shook his head. "I could get 6 bills for this place, easy," he said. 7 even. He cracked a window, he zipped his jacket. He went to open the kitchen cabinets, which one expects to find in kitchen cabinets, but also other things. 5 years is a long time. One of us added. Ah, hell, my landlord said in a different voice. He was breathing through his nose, for one thing. Your grandpa used to say I was like a Jew. Luongo, he would say, in my eyes, you're a Jew. And from him, I took it. I'll take it, I said, like it was the first time he told me. His eyes were wet, like men sometimes get near the end. He towed an unplugged cord to see where it led and shook his head when he did. Jesus, Clay, this is your icebox. You were supposed to take care of things and keep an eye out. That's 2 jobs, I said. A couple minutes later, and he was still shaking his head. I watched him through the bedroom window. For 2 blocks, I could hear his truck rattle. No wonder Grandpa Ike liked him. He'd always known his grandkids weren't cut out for the family business, but still. My kid brother Eli's first crash into that house was at the foot of Jenks, had wiped out his inheritance. His second crash wiped out mine. Now I only had a month or so left of walking around money, another year of eating money, maybe. But if I also had to make rent, forget it. Our sister Libby was doing okay, I guess. But I hadn't seen her since Eli's Shiva. Is this my fault? I asked her when she made it clear that she didn't want to hug me. I was here for him, she said. Where were you? He didn't want to see me, I said. I thought about it. I reminded him of him. Eli looked up to you. He hated mirrors, I said, touching the sheet on the hall one. Why can't you see things for what they are, she said, making a face that even I could get. And now it had been 5 years. How many Mays are there in 5 years? May is always hard, but this one was cold and wet, like March. Maybe this is just what spring is for us now.
That was beautiful. Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Yeah? No? Is it on? Okay, great. Hi. I was thinking about this as I was coming down here because grief is such a strange subject in that when you hear about it, you want to run from it a little bit. You're like, grief, no, thank you, that's okay. I'm going to do something else with my day. Until you have been through it, and then you need to find words to address it, and you need them badly. And one of the things that I thought of when I was reading each of these books, which are marvelous in their approach to it, is how deeply they probe into that specific pain that is hard to express and kind of draw a ring around it to make it understandable for the parts of ourselves that we hide from ourselves. So I have all sorts of questions for you guys. I'm going to try to keep it to a minimum, but I do feel like every work that you do, every piece that you do starts with a seed, meaning either an image or a section or something that kind of makes you catch fire, that shows you some part of yourself as a writer or a world that you want to see more of. Can you guys each talk a little bit about what that was for you? Martha, do you want to start? You're smiling at me.
Sure. Well, I was on sabbatical for a year, and as one could hear from this, I arrived in a place in Italy that, first of all, was unknown to me, with some baggage that was not just what was in my suitcase, but emotionally feeling in a crouch, let's just say, hands over head. That's something that came to me as an image that's in the book. And I figured I wanted to write about this place and the experience of being in this new environment. I did not set out to write about grief or loss. I set out to chronicle this experience of strangeness, of estrangement, that was really, at first, just geographic and linguistic, but quickly became apparent to me that also implicated in that was another kind of self-estrangement. And so essays began to accumulate around that. And my mother was not well during this time, and she died after that year ended, about a month after I got back to the States. And it took time gradually for me to understand that she would be a sort of through line as a personality and the experience of losing her. I should say I was aided in that by my editor at Catapult, Lee Newman, who urged me forward on creating and strengthening that through line. So one sometimes does need nudges from elsewhere.
Did you have other essays that weren't in the book?
A few, yeah, I did. And I began to publish the essays individually, and then they started to cohere. And then I had the fun part, which you guys know of making it all, getting the silly putty and forming it into a shape.
At about what point in your process did you understand that you had a book?
I would say 4 or 5 essays in, I began to see certain kinds of almost unconscious threading, and any of you who are writers here will sort of recognize that moment. If you are doing separate essays, but they're beginning to accumulate around certain feelings or ideas, where words and images and sort of notions begin to talk to one another. And poetry, language, seeing and being seen because of my mother's blindness, various things started to sort of accumulate. And that gave me more courage. I began to feel, okay, there's some traction, some coherence here. It took 4 or 5 essays, and then it was like, maybe there's a book. And then you sort of go, hush, don't talk about it. See what happens. So, yeah.
Charles, what about you?
The novel Alice and Oliver is very much, it's based on the first year of my late wife's illness. And she got sick at a certain point when our daughter was 6 months old, and we were staying for a little while at a house in New Hampshire, and over July 4th weekend, she got ill and ended up being driven 2 hours to Dartmouth Hitchcock, where she then spent a month with getting high-dose chemo. So it was this thing all of a sudden literally drops like a piano, or dropped like a piano. And all kind of whatever I had been planning to write or thinking about, I had a book come out, and I was trying to figure out what I was doing next. And that stopped because other things matter more. And but so for a month I slept in the hospital room with her on the couch folds out into a long cot. And her mom came up and was staying at a hospice and taking care of, helping to take care of our daughter, where she would be with her at night. And at night, like a little thing would be, I couldn't use the bathroom in our room because it had to be just for her, and they were taking counts of things, and it had to be sanitized, and her white blood cell counts were low. So that meant taking a 5-minute walk, and just, you see a detail, you see little things, and because that's just how we live in the world, and because your radar is up, you want to do something with it. And I didn't want to I had no thoughts of writing a book, but I was taking notes because I had to take notes to know what kind of pills or things or formula or whatever it was when I went out into the world the next day at the drugstore to get. So I started adding little observations. And after a month, she was well enough to come back to Manhattan and for us to start trying to get transfer care to a hospital here and figure out all the steps that she would need. And honestly, my editor took me to lunch and said, you know what, you need to write about this. This is not going to go away from your life. This is what you're in. And I was...
At what point did your editor say that to you? Where were you in?
Oh, she had been Oh, it's so early. It hasn't been, it's been a month since she's been diagnosed.
Okay.
It's still 6 months from when a donor will come for a bone marrow transplant, and my late wife was ill for a number of years, for basically 2.5, 3 years. And none of that was book writing time.
Mm-hmm.
That was trying to keep people alive time.
Yeah.
And, but he said, you're going to be in this. And then and my first response was to fuck with you,
Mm-hmm.
But then you also were of a certain generation, and you, as one of your peers, that Lori Moore story, people like that are the
Yes.
only ones here. Once you read it, you can't not read it. And that line, "Now give me the money," or where the husband says, "Start taking notes." And that stayed. And so I just started, I started doing just thinking. And I think that, my original plan was for a very different book, because I imagine everything we did was with the idea that hopefully my wife would live. But and then it changed. And then at a certain point, that changed, and I scrapped whatever vague outlines I had and started something else. But that my sense is that there's all kinds of roads to the mansion on the hill, and you take whatever you got to take. However, whatever and for me, I'm sure we'll talk about this more, and I know you have more interesting things to say than I do, but that then it changed when I was writing the book. Grief was a huge part of it. It's on, even when I'm fighting against it very much to have funny jokes or to portray New York in a certain way. You're pushing against. I was pushing against a certain rock, and also trying very much to engage with memories and ideas of someone that I very much wanted to hold on to.
Yeah.
So,
I'm amazed.
long, ridiculous answer. Thank you for this.
That's a great answer. I'm amazed that you were writing it in the moment. I think it also, there's something about the writing that is so potent and very visceral, and I'm amazed that you could do that in that moment. That's extraordinary.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, now I'm wasted, and I can't even, I could barely write my name before, but now I need someone to hold my hand for that. So, but I think but thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Max, what about you?
I started with, the book started with just a very quiet moment of kind of like sort of civic grace, of just sort of strangers meeting. And we often think of sort of urban loneliness as a bad thing, as an alienation. But I've always seen it as kind of like a quiet communion that's held in that kind of passing of strangers. And I had an anecdote that I'd stolen, from a friend. And I wanted to, I knew that was the ending. And I knew that I had to earn that ending. And then 25 years later, I found a way to get there. And life intervened. And probably the biggest influence on the book is the fact that I met my future wife, who had lost her previous boyfriend to suicide. And I was living with her and with that, and with her living with that. And I just saw just how temporally complex that reality was. And I just tried to help her however I could, which as often as not meant listening. And because I'm a writer and I'm awful, taking notes. But she was okay with that. She gave me my blessing. She gave me her blessing to write about that relationship that one has with someone who chose to opt out. And in the interim, I lost a dear friend of mine and my cousin within a month of each other. And it found its way into the book in many ways, which sounds ghoulish, but I mean, you know, you write and you often just wind up moving nothing around on a page, and then life arrives and steadies your hand and moves it. And I don't know, I felt finally the pulse of the book, and I had the shape, sort of, although Julie will disagree because I hadn't met her yet, and she had a lot to say about the shape. My editor, another shout out to a Catapult editor, but one that's warranted because it was still rather shapeless. And I just kind of, it was inefficient.
I have a question. The anecdote that you said you started with, and you knew that was the ending, did you end with it?
Yeah.
You did?
Oh, yeah.
It went right
I was
there.
like, fuck it, I'm ending with this. That's an ending. I didn't know what a book was, but that's how a book ends. I know that much. I'm no fool. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I'm stubborn.
Hear that. So one of the things after I read all your books, I stalked you guys online like anyone would, and I realized that all of you are quite accomplished with both fiction and nonfiction. You can do either quite well, and it made me curious about why you chose the form you did. So Martha, you did a kind of a series of essays, and you talked to us a little bit about how that started, but you also come from a fiction background, and I was curious, why did you go to this?
Well, I mean, for starters, I was in the midst of a novel that was that I was dragging. As my friend Alice Madison, the novelist, says, when you write a novel, it's like having an elephant in a sack behind you that you're dragging. It's heavy and ungainly. And I had been dragging my elephant for some time. So along with everything else, I arrived in Castiglione, this little medieval village in Italy, with a great big elephant in a sack that I had to haul up the hill every day. And so there was that. And the idea.
But you realize that it's sort of like you had an elephant, and then to me it's like you also picked up a donkey.
Yeah. But a donkey's different from an elephant, and B, a little lighter, and it brays, whereas elephants just, I don't know, they drink a lot of water. And
remember things.
They will not be budged when they don't want to be.
Yeah.
And so I had these two in my zoo, and it seemed like the one that I could work with was the donkey. So that's what began to happen.
And did you were you still working on the novel, or did you move toward the essays?
I was. And so when one of them got noisy, I would listen, and then when the other did, I would go back and forth.
Yeah.
But that's why the essay form was very sort of hospitable to me creatively, because I could do it in spurts. I could, just give myself a little assignment and see if I could wrap it up within a certain period of time. And it was a relief from the elephant in the sack, actually, to have it.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Max, with your book, you have this sort of, you move around the shape of a missing person. And there's a lot, you're kind of, as you're reading, you're putting together with each story, you're kind of putting together the shape of a particular kind of loss, right? But the stories are connected, but they don't sew completely together. And it was how did you make that choice?
You call it a choice, which I love.
How did that happen to you?
Yeah. It's just how I see. This is a cop-out. I'm sorry. It's a smart question and a good question, and I'm going to give a dumb, lazy answer. But I feel like that's just how I think.
Yeah.
And it's how I see things, as sort of just kind of revolving around one another constantly.
And I wait for the wiper blades, you know, to kind of go into sync and then pull out of sync and then go back into sync. And I don't know, to me that's like, there's a music in that.
Yeah.
That I've always found, you know, moving and inspiring. And, you know, limiting, because that's just how I can only see things. But I often feel like linear time, I'm always amazed by it. I'm always fascinated by it, like other people's descriptions of it, because I'm like, oh, that sounds incredible. And then another thing happens, and I need recipes to do that. Like, I love reading cookbooks, because I'm like, holy shit, it all, like, there's an order, and like it happens in real time, and then you do this, and then this, and then this, because, yeah, for me, life feels like a recipe in the wrong order.
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't know, you figure it out. It's like a ransom note made out of other recipes for like different things. And that's just how I just see the world. I'm like, this might be, what is this, goulash? I don't even know. But like there's, like, are there peppers? I don't know. I'll turn into goulash somehow. But I'm gonna brown the zucchini first.
There you go.
Is there zucchini in it? I don't even know, but it'll be great.
This is a very good metaphor.
Thank you. It's not, but yeah.
Charles, yours is so interesting because it's writing that scene between something that happened in your life, and as you told us, you were writing it, you were beginning it in those moments, but you fictionalized it. You decided not to do a memoir.
Yeah,
Why?
because I don't like money, and I don't want to meet Oprah, and I never imagined it as a memoir. There was a time when Martha was teaching where I went to graduate school, and like, you know, you read the archivist, I love novels. I love fiction. I love what it does. I feel like it's a grand, great stage, and I believe in the things that it does in a tremendously large degree. I'm comfortable kind of living in that created space. If I was going to do this, and there's a lot of, you know, it's easy to dismiss, to say, oh, well, it's a memoir, or it's a veiled memoir, it's a romantic, whatever it is. If I was going to do this, I couldn't be matchy-matchy. Matchy-matchy is too painful. Matchy-matchy is impossible, and the day-to-day of it is not an option, because already, like as mentioned, when you talk about grief, and you see the veil, you see someone's face just drop. You see all the reasons a person doesn't want to look at it, and I didn't want that, but I did want different things. And I did feel like there was a way of using this to ask questions about, what do you owe yourself? What do you owe the people you love, or the people who love you? And kind of what really matters when under an impossible situation. Because those things are not always, they're not hand in hand. They often push at each other. Sure. And because it was hard to go through, and it was hard for me, but that's nothing, whatever I would feel bad about, that's nothing compared to this poor woman who's in this bed.
Right.
And meanwhile, and yet, there's also the swirl of the lovely people from the health insurance company who explain to you that you are fast approaching the ceiling on your care. I mean, and these are things that are horrible and they're bad, but they're also, you know what? This is the stuff that you know what? There's something here. This is the stuff that why write a novel if a novel hasn't kind of saved or changed your life? Well, this has the opportunity. I could see that. And I felt that changing the time period, changing the character from a woman who was trying to get a PhD into maybe someone who's a freelance fashion person, doing some things to make where you imagine this could be fun to write about, and also make it a little reader, things that allow a reader access in.
Yeah.
That may have been that honestly could have been mistakes. Maybe I could have had other choices that might have been better ones, but this was how I thought about addressing it. And and when I would start a new chapter or start a section and look at, let's say, what are my notes? And part of those notes might be based on events that happened or events that I had heard of and were going to smush in, or whatever I was going to do. But that first day of looking at the notes would always be, all right, I'm just going to go in bed and I'll check in within about 3 hours. Huh. But somewhere around hour 2, the pure horror fades a little bit, and you start to think, oh, what is the scene? What could it be? What could I do with it? What other things need to be happening with other characters?
Right.
That's a world that, because I had written and spent a long time writing a book previously, I had a level of familiarity with that.
The familiarity with going to the imaginary
with going
place
to the imaginary
and the
place
relief of the imaginary place.
Yes, and thinking in terms of scene or thinking in terms of characters.
Yep.
And maybe it could have been maybe all those things could have been a memoir, and maybe it could have added up that way. But when I started the book, I may have known, look, I don't need to know all the answers, right, because it's going to be a long time before I get to the middle, and I'll have had more distance, and I'll be able to deal with the end game more when I get to the end game. Mm-hmm. But I also, at the beginning, there was no way without the veils that I could have sat there and been truthful. I needed the veils to write what I felt was true in terms of to create a story that would hold up as its own truth.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
We're talking about one of the things that was kind of I realized was bugging me as I was trying to kind of think about what I wanted to ask you guys is there's an idea about grief as though it's a singular thing, as though it is something that right, it's always the same thing. But I feel like grief is as personal as a lover, meaning it is about who you are in the moment that it comes to you, how it lands on you, and who you become in reaction to it. And I wondered with each of your books, and I'm going to use the word protagonist here that it doesn't quite fit, but who was your protagonist? Who, like when I'm thinking of, I also wrote a book about grief, and I know that I was writing about a 30-year-old woman who had been lucky enough not to ever know it. And so when it landed on her, it was really out of the blue. It was with a kind of she'd known it in some ways, but she hadn't known it in the adult, this is how someone leaves you slowly way. And when you wrote yours, who was the protagonist in the moment that landed on them? And what about it, kind of what shaped them? How did it shape them? How did the grief shape them? And I know, Martha, it's just you. So so I'm losing the word protagonist loosely.
Well, and one does have to, even in nonfiction, recognize that there's a persona being created.
Right.
I mean, the formally, in terms of genre, the line is very wiggly and porous, as it should be, and that was important for me, too, so that I could contend with different aspects of the losses I was dealing with, which were, this was not sort of one piano landing. This had been, I referred to it in the book as the La Strage, which is Italian for the massacre. It sort of felt like rat-tat-tat, just, just going down like dominoes. And that had, for me, a pretty negative effect on what I thought I could do as a writer. So really a large impetus for writing the book was to write my way out of what had become a pretty serious writer's block.
Yeah.
And the elephant was proof of that. That the elephant was really in the bag more than out drinking water. And so, you know, this protagonist decided, who was also me, the author, just decided to kind of go at the question of where was I?
Yeah.
And what was I encountering in the new place I was at that would somehow shed some light on these losses? And the question of presence and absence became very key to me, because I don't think we can talk about absence without also talking about different kinds of presence that memory gives and that other people, other experiences give to refine the absence, to make it sometimes much sharper and sometimes softer, to blur it. And all the while there was this question of something impending. So in a way, my book was linear, and Max's goulash recipe was not one that I was following. I was more or less going chronologically through this time. But I was also very aware of a kind of cycling back and around and goulashy things happening as I was there for this year, as the relationship of what was present and absent kept sort of switching up on me, and as I was encountering things that were new to me, in which was embedded loss, like a friend who had ALS, an Italian,
Yeah.
who I didn't know, and so that was both new and something that was, for my husband, old. And so there was all that kind of resonant presence-absence stuff going on.
And the cruise ship as well, right?
And the cruise ship as well. Yes, there's a chapter in a section in the book, an essay in the book that has to do with the Costa Concordia, the boat that went, that shipwrecked off a small Italian island. And there too, I had to watch people dealing with this strange, bulky, present thing that also was implied its own loss and would be its own loss going forward. So the book just kind of got itself organized around the experience of these presences and absences, and me moving through time, dealing with them. I don't know if that addresses what you're saying.
Yeah. You know, well, I mean, I feel like every loss is multiple losses, and I mean, I feel like that's what both of your books do. It's like the 8 losses, and then the 38 losses on the ship. And you think, oh, okay, in the context of a cruise ship, 38 losses, but you're like, well, wait a minute.
Right.
8, holy crap, 8 losses, and then 38 losses. And they have a way of sort of folding back in on themselves. And I feel like a similar thing happens in your book, Charles, where the case studies.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's just like, I mean, you talk about protagonists, you talk about the antagonist of cancer, you know, just this villain.
Right.
And he's busy, you know. He's got no end of time, and he's just always busy. I mean,
I really tried to write with the idea of that, the cancer the Game of Thrones villain.
It's
That
like
you
the devil.
That you cannot be.
Yeah.
That there is no, and the idea that the book could be a very readable. I mean, you need a delusion. You need a delusion to write a novel. You have to. You have to have your own idea of how the world, of what is going, and it doesn't matter, because the truth is the world doesn't give a fuck. But you can't know that or believe that. You have to. And I had this idea that this was a book that could. That could be a thriller, or could be a very engrossing, with a villain who is every bit as indestructible as you know, as a Game of Thrones dragon or whatever. And because it is something that is part of industrialized life. You know, I didn't mean to stop your answer, but right, and that presence moves along with loss, and moves along with the presence of the people that we care about, and these, 8 lives. It's basically it's a baseball lineup. It's a huge amount. When you think about your friends and your families and the people that you're really close to, 8 people is a lot. It's just so much life.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about you, Max, when play starts?
Well, I mean, it's sort of, I mean, and the shape of the book comes from this idea as well, is that the present is however much past you have up until that moment.
Yeah.
So it allows whatever past there is to inform it and to locate it. And that past is, as often as not, defined by loss, by death. And I was thinking a lot about something my father-in-law had said after he buried his father, with whom he had a very complicated relationship. And he said that they picked out a headstone for him, and he had already picked out his plot, and he had already picked out his plot for his still living wife, because that was just how it was done, a very formal, old kind of approach.
Yeah.
And I could tell it was upsetting my father-in-law, this idea that, you know, there was already this plot waiting, and then there was this plot to put his father. And then he said something, he said, well, the dead need an address. And that, it took a long time for that to really make sense to me, but
Yeah.
in the sense that,
What does that mean to you?
well, it's a place to go.
Yeah.
It's a destination. It's a place that I mean, a place to bring what you feel. It's a place to bring your pasts and locate them in the present. I mean, and you know, I feel like, you know, so much of, it's hard not to think about all of this stuff, but you know, just there should be plaques on everything.
Yeah.
You know, there should be statues everywhere. It should be really hard to get in. I mean, it's like traffic calming. It should just be like, oh shit, there's the monument for this, and the plaque that, you know, celebrates that or reminds us of that.
This moment mattered.
Yeah.
Yeah. This life mattered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it is. It's a loss
Yeah.
of some kind, a civic loss, a personal loss,
Yeah.
a familial loss. But there's something about that location, and obviously my book is about place. I mean, place is a character.
Yeah.
In my book, maybe the character, maybe
Yeah,
the protagonist.
absolutely.
I mean, in many ways, clay is a sort of, you know, vessel that holds place, you know, and comparatively cipher-like in some respects.
So each of you, I feel like I have to now just ask you individual questions, because I felt like in each book when I was reading, I felt like there was some point at which I was like, this person has a superpower, and because there was something that I had never seen done in that specific way. Martha, with you, one of the things that I was really aware of when I was reading is you had so much confidence in your wandering. I know that you've done novels, and I know you know everything about plot and pacing, but there was some way in which you really allowed yourself to wander, and my attention never strayed, and I just felt like there was so much confidence in how you did it, in letting yourself go to places and come back. And I wondered how you allowed that when you were doing it. Did you have some voice over your shoulder saying, like, you've got to get back to the point, or did you just let it come through you?
No, it came, and then one edits, you know, and again, a lot of it is a question of digressions that allow for resonances elsewhere. So, I mean, I tried to keep it as trim and taut as I could, while allowing for that strategy of sort of some vagabonding.
And I don't mean to imply that that there wasn't a structure. There was this through line, and I was absolutely engaged. But I was just surprised at all the places that you went. I was sort of surprised, like, oh, we're going here now. It was like pulling back and finding a little miracle in every corner. And I just felt like it just felt like freedom to me. It felt like a different kind of freedom than I ever feel.
I think it was the freedom I needed to give myself permission to have, which is, I think, always available to the writer, but the question is, what hampers it? And I had this, you know, sort of inner story going on for so long around, you know, these people have died, and who am I to sort of pick up and carry on? It had come to that. And so these essays were a way to just liberate myself from that.
That makes sense. I'm glad I asked. Charles, with one of the things that's very striking about your book is you started with one point of view, a kind of the third person, and we're seeing things from the outside, and then you switch. and you go into Alice. And when it happens, I actually said, no way, when I was reading the book. I was like, you can't do this, but you could.
Right.
And you did, and I was taken. And how did that happen? How did you start writing that way? When did it occur to you?
That's a good, interesting question. Diana had a laptop, and while she was ill, she had wanted to write a book, like a self-help book for other women who would have cancer. You know, it was something that, and it wasn't a very, what she left was not advanced. It was kind of thoughts or paragraphs, and a lot of it was journaling. And she was a religious journaler, but I'm a year and a half into the book or so, and maybe I have 150 pages of it, and my computer bus breaks down, and I have to, for a week or 2 weeks, I have to write on her computer, and at some point I just started clicking files and found her and found the notes that she had been keeping, or went looking for the notes and then found them. But then I opened it up, and there she was. There her voice was, and a very like presence of reading it, and I could see her and hear her. And like I said, nothing was finished. Nothing was even, I wouldn't even say it's usable in the sense of being advanced, but there's this voice. I knew at that point, I knew for what the structure of the book was, there's a point where she needs a bone marrow transplant and has to go in and start taking the tests for whether or not she's even well enough to take it. And what I had in the book is that she's been through so much at that point that they don't even know if that will happen, which is not what life was like. But for my purposes, I wanted to do that, and I wanted the marriage to be at a loggerheads, and all these things need to be bubbling up. And it just occurred to me, well, what if she tells it? Mm-hmm. What if we think it's this, we think it's going this way, and then why can't her voice take the last third of the book?
Right.
And you know, when I showed pages to, you know, then it became to my editor, he was like, well, can you, you know, then it was his, because there's other parts where there's still the other voice, the third person voice that explains what the husband is going through. And he was like, get rid of that voice. We just want her.
That's true, right.
It didn't work that way. It couldn't work that way, and it shouldn't. And the book is better because if I took it out, it's not as powerful. In fact, when we go back to her, but once I understood that I could go into that. Once I think this is true with most writers. Once you get an idea, and it's kind of a dangerous idea or a little bit scary, but you can't unget it. You can't turn back and go, you know what, that would be really good, but I'm going to do it a different way that's not as good because I'm afraid of that way.
Yeah.
So, and then the poker player in me started to think, well, how do you structure it? How can you make it so that when that does come, or if you're going to do it that way, that it'll be lightning. So when it hits at her weakest, with the most questions, and it is a gamble. And I did, have someone, I did have it in New York Times saying the book doesn't come alive until the last third. No matter what you do well, someone's going to tell you you're fucked up. So, that's just, there's people out there who just fucking, that's just what they do. And, but by my thinking, that was a sign that the book worked. That's a sign that everything has plugged in and it's right.
Yeah.
Because there's no way of preparing for it. And then once it's there, oh, who is this? And it's not Diana, like Lee would tell you. She was friends with her. It's not her, but
Right.
there's sentences that built 150 pages that are very true. There's a sentence where in Diana's journals that said, Charles is often miserable, I am not. And once I read that, it was another one where I couldn't unread it.
Huh.
And it seemed to open up an idea of a quest that she was on and of where I was at and how all this was playing on me, and that I would have enough distance or enough thought or enough self-reflection to say, there's something there and I should push that in these characters and build off it. And so that was, it was and it really did just come from kind of opening and seeing this voice and also thinking I do want to use it, but I want to use it in my way, and I want to use it to build a character that will stand up and do all the things the book needs to do, and that also will, as I write it, allow me to do honor and justice to a person whose presence animates what I'm trying to do as well. Yeah.
I found that what it did was, I disagree with the New York Times report.
Everyone should.
I feel like
in that case.
but I feel like it made more real to me the loss.
Yeah.
Right.
And in a way that was and it happens in the way that the reckoning of a loss happens, which is that this is so real.
Right.
How can this be the thing that's going to go back? How is this going to be the thing that is lost?
Well, that was the hope, is because there was even a point where she's about to go in a coma, or she does go in a coma, and then there's 10 pages of the doctor's point of view, a nurse's point of view, going into all these other people's heads.
Right.
But her voice is gone, and wanting her voice back.
Yes.
Makes you aware of of what is being lost.
Absolutely.
That's the chess.
Yeah.
Like there's checkers, there's chess, and then there's 3D Star Wars chess. This stuff at its best is the 3D Star Wars game.
Okay.
And that's what, for anyone who takes notes or who is interested in this as a craft thing, that's what keeps you able to deal with hard, sad stuff, is
Sure.
kind of one of the things. There's many things,
Yeah.
but that's one.
Yeah.
Mira, can we go to audience questions?
Yes.
Okay, so we have time for 3 questions.
Yeah.
I have a question about whether writing fictionally about grief or non-fictionally and loss, after you've written it, is there an alleviation of the pain, or is there something good or progress, or is there any change in you?
You do that one. You take
Okay,
that.
I'll take that one. No. I don't know. You've given it, I feel like I've given it an address, a place I can visit, and it's and a place maybe that other people can visit. I mean, there's a reason they make cemeteries like shady and beautiful, right? They're very carefully designed, and so you don't have to go there to grieve a specific loss. You can grieve, and I think we all bring our grief, to reading. And so I guess I feel better for having fixed it, you know, to a location, given it an address.
Yes, in the back.
For each of you, when did you know that you were ready to write about these losses?
Excuse me, could you repeat?
Yes, sorry. For each of the authors, when did they know they were ready to write about the losses?
I can say very quickly that I didn't know anything about when I would be ready or not. I didn't actually start chronicling my mother, certain moments of my mother's decline until after she was gone. Other things I could write before. I think everyone draws their line in the sand that way, where they need to. And there were certain things I couldn't actually put on the page till she had died.
What about you, Charles?
Oh, I think I did this one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
more or less. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't realize I was doing it. That's my answer until after the fact. You know, you don't, and I think that Charles' book illustrates this, and Martha's book as well, illustrates that you don't have time for loss, right? Like life is going on and it just happens. And you keep doing what you're doing while this is happening. And yeah. So if what's part of what's happening is your writing, it gets in there.
I do. One thing I would say is that I found that as I was writing, there were things I didn't want to forget. You know, there were things that were very difficult and hard, and I know that I wouldn't remember them. But I had notes that could bring them back to me, and then I could put myself in and then I could recreate the situation or change it, and you know, add unicorns or whatever. And but that being ready, there's a saying that, you know, from this poet who was killed by Stalin, where he used to say all great works of literature are divided into those written with and without permission. And the only ones that matter are the ones without, are the second. And I think in my case, there were things that I was better off with wrestling with than I was letting sit and letting go. And that I enjoyed the misery of wrestling with them more than I would have enjoyed the misery of just letting it pass and trying to capture it from a much later time. There's certain things that I probably do need that I would feel differently about, and things like my parents or what have you, where I might need more time, or there's things I couldn't write about while they were living because I just couldn't have them read it. But in this case, I think it was part of my grieving process was living and trying to wrestle with things and trying to animate and appreciate a beautiful, complicated person who was not here anymore, and also trying to change that person in some ways, but still keep that spirit alive. And I don't think it gets fixed. You know, I think grief, we all know it's not linear. You pass where there was a restaurant where you had a fight, and it's now changed ownership 4 times, but you know
still
that
betrayed.
you're still, but you were right. You were still betrayed in that restaurant,
Right.
and you don't get past it. But I think it just helps you live with these holes, you know, and accept that they're going to be part of you for part of your inner landscape for, I don't know. I mean, mine still is a deep part of mine.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, in the back.
There's a certain amount of bravery required about writing about anything, but it seems particularly vulnerable to write about your grief. this occurred to me when you were talking about the New York Times review, but in general, to put it out there that in a way that could perhaps be judged, it seems like to judge somebody, the quality of somebody's grief is particularly fucked up. And so I wonder, like, does writing about this kind of topic make you feel more vulnerable, or not?
You know, I would say it's really, it comes down to it's all about the writing. It's
Right.
about the language. And, you know, you're always trying to find a language commensurate to the material you're working with. And I just got absorbed with, at a certain point, after I did my initial just kind of put stuff out there, vagabonding, whatever, then it was, how do I make this a good book?
Yeah.
Right,
And
right,
that's
right.
in the end, you know, where it always lands, no matter what genre you're working in,
Right.
and really no matter what material you're working in. I didn't in the end feel like the fact that it was grief made that any more or less challenging a task for me than it always would be. You know, at the end of the day, that's what you have to be able to say. I worked this language along I mined it and worked it along its various seams in the way that I had to.
I think that's all we have time for. I want to thank the Center for Fiction for having us. Thank you all for coming. And thank our three authors.